it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our 10 a.m. showcase lecture entitled Tolkien's Invented Languages in The Lord of the Rings. This is a 1-hour special lecture to kick off our showcase. This session features our language sector, and it will be presented by James Tauber. James Tauber is a philologist, linguist, and software developer who works with scholars around the world using computers to better understand languages and texts. He has taught several classes in Signum's master's and space programs. He also heads up the Digital Tolkien Project, which studies Tolkien from both a corpus linguistic and digital humanities perspective. And did you know the Digital Tolkien Project won the 2025 Tolkien Society Award for Best Online Content? This just kind of dropped recently. Huge congrats, James. So delighted to have you presenting today. Over to you.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. Let me just share my screen and we will get started. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. Can I just get a quick confirmation and then I'll get started? All good? Excellent. Okay, so welcome to this showcase lecture on Tolkien's invented languages in The Lord of the Rings. So I want to start off just getting you thinking about a couple of things in Lord of the Rings and the way that Tolkien's invented languages are used. Consider the following words that we are not explicitly told are Elvish, but I'll tell you now, these are all Elvish words. Angband, Angmar, Angbor, and Angathas. Now, if you look at these words, what's the common element in these? There's something that they all share in common. I think it's pretty obvious what it is. They all start with the letters A-N-G, ang. When words have common elements like that, it raises the question, do they also have some sort of shared common meaning? Is there something in the meaning of these words that's shared between them because they have ang in them? Now, it turns out we're not explicitly told within Lord of the Rings what these particular words mean. But we can work a lot of it out. And there are some cases where we get words that have this ang element in them and we are told what they mean. So let's start looking at a couple of those just to get things going. So in chapter 4, book 3 of Lord of the Rings, Treebeard says that Saruman settled down at Angranost, or Isengard, as the men of Rohan call it. So here we find out that Angranost, another one of these ang starting words, is actually another name for Isengard. And we're told that Isengard is actually the name that the men of Rohan call it. Now, it turns out Isengard is an Old English word, and we won't get into it too much in today's class, but Tolkien used Old English as a representation of the language of the Rohirrim. Isengard, or Eisen in particular, the Eisen part of Isengard, is the Old English word for iron. And that gives us a bit of a clue of what Angrenost means and possibly what ang means. But the real clincher is in chapter 2 of book 6, we read that the narrows of Eisenmouth, the iron jaws of Karach Angren. So we get another one of these Angren words, starting with ang. And we're told that this corresponds to the Eisenmouth, and that's the iron jaws of Karach. So bringing all this together, we've got strong evidence that ang means iron. Okay, so what I'm doing today is really just giving you a taste of a month-long course of the same name, Tolkien's Invented Languages in The Lord of the Rings. And the goal of the overall course is to provide a general and gentle introduction to Tolkien's invented languages. And my hope is that along the way you learn some basic linguistic concepts and terminology, but also get some hands-on skills in language description. Now, today, in this morning's lecture, I'm going to focus particularly on the Fellowship of the Ring and within that, place names and poetry. So we're not in any way going to be covering everything. This is just to give you a taste of the full thing, the full module. Now, there are a number of different ways that one can approach the study of a language. Many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with doing language courses or using language apps, where most of the focus is on communication and developing communicative skills within a language, often speaking or listening to native speakers and so on. That's the primary way that modern languages are learned. There's another approach which tends to be more common, or certainly was more common with historical languages, which is to learn from grammars and dictionaries. And arguably, you're not really learning the language when you do this, you're just learning about the language. But this is very common as a way of learning, for example, Gothic. Joseph writes, Gothic grammar was the way that Tolkien himself first became familiar with the Gothic language. It's the very same book I learnt Gothic from at Signum University. So that's another way of learning languages. But there's another way, or learning about languages. There's a third way of learning about languages, which is studying the way that they're used. And this is actually the way that linguists do it, right? They'll either, if it's a living language, they will talk to speakers of the language or listen to speakers of the language. If it's a historical language, maybe they're poring over texts or fragments of texts in many cases to try to work out how the language worked just from those fragments. And as we'll see, that's actually the approach that we're going to take in this course to better understanding Tolkien's invented languages. There are a number of challenges with Tolkien's invented languages that I think make that a really interesting approach to take. First of all, that we simply don't have enough material from Tolkien himself to really undergo any kind of communicative process in any meaningful way. And what a lot of people have done who really want to speak to one another in Elvish is they have to invent a lot of new stuff that Tolkien himself didn't necessarily provide. But I think an even bigger issue with Tolkien's invented languages, or at least approaching them with the typical approach that one would take to language learning, is that Tolkien kept changing his mind. He never really settled down on an exact way that languages settle on the way the languages would work. He was constantly changing his mind about grammar, about vocabulary, and so on. And that makes it difficult to, for example, have a Sindarin course on Duolingo or something like that, because the question is, which version of Sindarin do you mean? Which version of Quenya do you mean? Here's what Tolkien himself said about the topic of learning Elvish. No, I wouldn't mind other people knowing it, enjoying it, but I don't really want to make it like some people who have been equally inventive in language have done, which is sort of make cults and have people all speaking it together. No, I don't desire to go and have afternoons talking Elvish to chaps. For one thing, of course, Elvish is too complicated. I've never finished making it. So we get a sense here, and you apologize for my impression. The main issue that Tolkien had with it, besides somewhat of his concerns about the cultish nature of it, was that he never finished making it. It comes back to this problem of it was constantly changing. So the scope of the module, the month-long module, and indeed certainly this class this morning, is we're going to just focus on what was revealed about the languages within the Lord of the Rings. So we're going to pretend we don't know about the Silmarillion or the history of Middle-earth or any of the amazing work of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship in publications like the Vinya Tengwa or Parma El de Lambaron. We're just going to treat the Lord of the Rings, including appendices E and F in the main course, as our field work, as the scraps of language that we have from which we can learn more about the languages. There are a couple of benefits, I think, to this approach. I don't know if did something change for someone else. I haven't changed anything on my side. If people are not seeing, not seeing my, you can see the slides, but not me. Yeah, I have nothing to do with that. That's however this call was set up, turned off I've got my video turned on, but for whatever was changed to whatever was set up for this talk, unfortunately. You don't need to see me. The slides are what matters. Okay, as long as you can see the slides. The slides also disappeared. Okay. I don't know if there's any.
Maybe reshare.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, maybe try resharing.
How about that? Could you see the slides before? Did something change, or have you never been able to see the slides?
I've always been able to see the slides.
We can see the slides. Yeah, just not your video.
Okay, people say they can see the slides. I don't care about my video. That's okay. I will continue. As long as you can see the slides, it's all good. Let me know if the slides disappear again, and I'll reshare. Okay, good. So the benefits of the particular approach that we're going to take today and we take in the full course is that it enables us to pick a fixed point in time. We get past the issues of Tolkien changing his mind because we're just looking at the way the language works in Lord of the Rings. It's a gentler approach as well because we're not bombarded with huge amounts of vocabulary and grammar rules and stuff like that, which Tolkien doesn't really provide us much of anyway. We're gradually introduced to vocabulary in context, which is, it was kind of fun. And that makes it a lot more interactive as well, because what we're going to do, we'll do it a little bit of this in this morning's class, but in the full lecture, we do a lot more of it. It's a lot more interactive. We can't be too interactive with the number of people that we have this morning, but hopefully you'll get a taste of the sort of stuff that we do. It becomes a bit more of a puzzle-solving adventure because we're going to look at words in text, in context, and like we did with that element, see what we can work out about how the language works. And as you can imagine from things I said before, this is actually more like what a linguist or philologist might do, dealing with some fragment of an ancient text, trying to work out what the language is and how it works. Okay, we already saw a couple of examples of what I refer to as parallel translation, where we're given the names of something in multiple languages, and that actually gives us a hint as to what the meaning of the words are in some of the languages, particularly if one of the languages that we're given in parallel translation is a language that we're familiar with or a language that we can easily look up. So the fact that Eisen or Isen is the Old English word for iron helps us to understand what's going on with Angkor. Potentially. There's some caveats there, some nuance that I'll touch on a little bit in a moment. But there are a couple of other examples that I'm actually going to dive into in a little bit more detail this morning. So one is this passage from chapter 12, book 1, where Strider says, "I'm afraid we must go back to the road here for a while. We have now come to the river Horwell that the elves call Mithaethel." And then we get Gimli's grand description of where they're headed in the Misty Mountains. I won't read this in a Gimli voice, but he says that he's never seen them except from afar in waking life, but he knows their names. For under them lies Khazad-dûm, the Dwaradelf that is now called the Black Pit, Moria in the Elvish tongue. Right, so you get this parallel translation here, where we're told in English, in Elvish, in Khuzdul, the names for various things. And then he says that yonder stands Barazimbar, the Red Horn, Cruel Caradhras, and beyond him are Silverteen and Cloudy Head, Celebdil the White and Fanwell the Grey, that we call Zerek-Ziggle and Bundushathur. So we get this wonderful collection of words in different languages that we can piece together the meaning from. And we'll do that in a few slides. But this concept of parallel translation, we'll come back to the third and fourth shortly, as I said. This whole idea of parallel translation, this is not unique to Tolkien. This is often done in texts that are particularly describing situations to people from a different region that may be not familiar with the geography and so on. So here are just two examples from the New Testament, for example, where we're told that when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And just a few verses later, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. So you can see it's very similar to what Tolkien was doing, giving the name of something, but also saying what it is in another language. What's particularly interesting about this, and it is sort of true of Tolkien's as well, if you sort of consider the conceit that Tolkien is just translating an existing text. In the Greek New Testament, the stone pavement is lithostroton, but the Hebrew is just given as Gabbatha. Similarly, the place of the skull in Greek is kraniotopon, but the Hebrew is Golgotha. So in other words, the Greek has been translated, but the Hebrew has just been transliterated. We haven't done the translation of the Hebrew. We're given what the Hebrew is. So in the Greek language, we're given the name of it in Greek and in Hebrew. In the English language, we're given it in English and in Hebrew. And that's similar to what Tolkien is doing in a way, right? He's giving us the English and the Elvish, or the Old English and Elvish. And the English and the Elvish are the English and the Old English are just translations from Westron or Rohanese. The Elvish is just transliterated. So it's not a new thing. This is a common way of dealing with particularly place names, where your audience is speaks a number of different languages. I just want to note before we dive into more of the Elvish side of things is that the situation is a little different when it comes to particularly hobbit names, names in the Shire, and to a lesser extent the men in Eriador, so around Bree and so on. When you look at names like Bag End or Balmfurlong, Bagshot Row, Buckland, Buckleberry, Bracegirdle, Budgeford, Bridgefield, Bywater, Burrows, these are not Elvish words. They're not even invented language words. These are English words, or at least words that Tolkien put together in a way that sounded English. Similarly, the names for the dwarves in The Hobbit and even the name Gandalf itself come from Old Norse. And I've already mentioned that the language spoken in Rohan, Tolkien substitutes with Old English. And the reason he does this, we'll talk a lot more about this in the full course, but just to say a little bit about that, Tolkien is wanting to give us a linguistic perspective similar to that of a hobbit. And so if words sound familiar to hobbits, he wants them to sound familiar to us. If they sound slightly unusual to hobbits, he wants them to sound slightly unusual to us. And if they sound completely foreign to a hobbit, he wants them to sound completely foreign to us. And that's why he translates the Westron language, the language of the hobbits and the language of the men of Bree and so on, into English, and the men of the Dale and the dwarves' external language into Old Norse, and the language of the Rohirrim into Old English. It's all to give us that sort of linguistic perspective that's similar to the hobbits. And we're not going to say much more about those. We're going to focus particularly on the Elvish languages for the rest of this morning, and for the most part in the course as well. Before we dive into some more interactive exercises, I want to read this quote from C.S. Lewis, because I think this is a wonderful quote anyway in terms of language learning. And when I teach ancient Greek, I always bring up this quote. But it's also, I think, an important point for us to take hold of in this context as well of this class. I'll just let you know that nous is an ancient Greek word. C.S. Lewis writes, the very formula nous means a ship is wrong. I can't do C.S. Lewis's voice, by the way. The very formula nous means a ship is wrong. Nous and ship both mean a thing. They do not mean one another. Behind nous, we want to have a picture of a dark, slender mass with sail or oars climbing the ridges, with no officious English word intruding. Now, in context, his point is more about a sort of better way of learning ancient languages. The goal of learning ancient Greek is not to be able to translate it, right? The goal of learning ancient Greek is to be able to read ancient Greek, to be able to understand ancient Greek. You shouldn't need to translate it if you understand the language itself. But there's an important concept here that I just want to bring up because it's relevant sometimes, which is that it's not that nous equals ship. It's that the Greek word nous and the English word ship both mean the sort of concept of a ship. We can get into sort of Caesarean ideas of and even Platonic ideas of form and so on here. But this is important when we're looking at when Tolkien is presenting us with an Elvish name and an English name. The key thing is not to necessarily think of them as translations of one another so much as they're terms that refer to the same underlying thing. Okay. That said, we will talk in terms of what the English equivalent of Elvish words is despite that. So let's come back to the first example that I said we were going to in more detail with parallel translation. And this is when Strider says, we've now come to the river Horwell that the elves call Mithaethel. So I'll just ask in the chat, if people want to write in the chat, does anyone know what the word whore means? The English word whore, or the component whore. You may more commonly hear it in the context of hoary. Somebody might be described as hoary, H-O-A-R-Y. Any ideas what that means? Right, it means grey. Yep, it's often referred to beards and so on, and so by extension, it can suggest the person is old and so on. But hoary means grey, and particularly with regard to grey hair. But grey is its original meaning. And so you can imagine that the river Horwell, and well here presumably doesn't mean a human-made well. It probably refers to like a wellspring, the spring, the source of the river. One might imagine that maybe the water is particularly grey looking at its source or something. But we're told that the elves call this river Mithaethel. Now we can't necessarily know for sure that Mithaethel means the same as Horwell, because different groups of people will call the same thing words with different meanings. But I'll let you know, in this case, it does have the same meaning. So given that, that suggests that Mithaethel probably has this same idea of the source of a river being grey or something. So I want you to think for a moment, you can type in the chat, what other words in Lord of the Rings, we're going to try to constrain our thoughts here to Lord of the Rings and not bring in stuff that we may have seen in the Silmarillion and so on. We're really imagining what it would have been like for people in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. What else have you seen myth in? What other Elvish words? Mithlond, Mithrandir. Yep. Any others? There's a particular metal. Mithril. Yes, exactly. So, what might myth mean? Given all those uses and given the fact that it's the Elvish name for the river Horwell and knowing that Horwell means. Not silver. Grey. Yes, grey, exactly. We're not going to look at it today because it's not revealed in Fellowship of the Ring, but in later parts of Lord of the Rings, of course, we're told the elves when they're actually no, it is in Fellowship because it's in Lothlorien, where when the elves are singing a lament to Gandalf, they refer to him as Pilgrim Grey, Mithrandir. So again, we get this parallel translation where the word grey shows up with a word that starts with myth. And here we've got not the word grey, the word whore, but that's like we saw with the Isengard situation, the Old English equivalent to the grey here. So what does that tell you about Aethel as well? So grey, I think, is pretty, the myth part is pretty clearly grey. But what might that suggest Aethel means? it's even more specific than stream. It is related to rivers, but it's the key is the well part of the Horwell. And we're not actually, the Lord of the Rings actually doesn't give us enough. Yes, it's spring, yeah, or the source of the river, yeah. And we're not given enough evidence really in Lord of the Rings itself, other than this. This is kind of a hint that it might mean that, but we will see other evidence. If you look beyond Lord of the Rings, it's later revealed that indeed there's a bunch of stuff with Aethel in the name that does have this notion of a spring or the source of a river and so on. Okay. So what we've been doing, what we did with the Ung and what we did with Methaethel, is look at the components of words. And in some cases, we may know what one component means, but maybe knowing what the whole word refers to then gives us a hint about what another component of the word might mean. And we actually get a really fun, explicit example of this in the Many Meetings chapter, when Bilbo says to Frodo, "But I thought you knew enough Elvish at least to know Dunedain, man of the West, Númenórean. But this is not the time for lessons." And so again, we get this parallel translation. But what's fun here is he actually breaks down Dún Adan. There's a hyphen there, Dún Adan, and it's glossed man of the West. So one could guess that Dunedain means man of the West. It refers to a Númenórean. And the implication is that maybe Númenórean also means man of the West, but we don't necessarily have enough evidence here. But it raises the question: if Dún Adan means man of the West, what part means what part means man, what part means West? We're going to need to see some other pieces of evidence to really pin that down. Although you might already have an idea thinking about other words that you've seen in Lord of the Rings. But indeed, it turns out Adan does mean man and the Dún means West. Does anyone know what Dunedain means? Men of the West, exactly. So Dunedain is man of the West. Dunedain is men of the West. It's the singular and the plural. And again, we're not going to go into detail about that this morning. We will in the full course. But we get a few indications throughout Lord of the Rings of how this particular Elvish language is the Sindarin, by the way, although we're never told, and it's very interesting. People are often surprised by this. The words Sindarin and Quenya do not appear in the main text of Lord of the Rings. That's not what the languages are ever referred to in the main text of Lord of the Rings. But there do turn out to be multiple Elvish languages, and we'll touch on that a little bit towards the end of this morning. But this turns out to be Sindarin, one of the Elvish languages. And I'll just say now, I won't elaborate on this. We'll get, as I said, we'll get into more detail about this in the main course. The way that plurals are made in Sindarin, and this is oversimplifying, but it'll give you a flavor for it. The way that things are made plural in Sindarin is you essentially make the vowels more I-like. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that. And sometimes it's actually inserting an I, so Adan becomes Edain. But notice the R at the start of Adan changes to an E. And we'll get into the details of why E is more I-like than R. It has to do with position of the tongue in the mouth and so on. But I just want to plant that seed, that one of the things we sort of pick up incidentally, Tolkien never explicitly says in Lord of the Rings, this is how you make plurals in Sindarin, right? It's not the sort of thing that you would read in a grammar book about this is how words become plural. But if you gather enough examples of singular and plural in Sindarin just from Lord of the Rings, you can build up an idea of the pattern. And we'll actually get to some more examples of that without necessarily going into the technical detail this morning. But now I want to spend a bit of time looking at a few more of these word components and seeing if we can get a sense of what various parts of words in Fellowship of the Ring in particular, these are all taken from Fellowship of the Ring. And we're going to try again not to bring in knowledge that we may have from outside Lord of the Rings to see what we can work out about some of these. And we're not going to be... The thing about all this is we can't necessarily be certain until we got hold of sort of unpublished stuff from Tolkien where he explicitly noted down what various components of words meant. But we can do a pretty good make pretty good guesses, and it turns out to be, I think, pretty fun to try to work it out. So I want to start off with Mordor. Now, Mordor, we're explicitly told as early as chapter 8 of book 1, we're told that Mordor is the Black land. So any guesses of what part means black and what part means land? Right. The more part means black. And this we've already seen, we'll come back to it, but we've already seen Moria, we're told means the black pit. So that's another example where we've seen the more in multiple places. We also get Morgul. But interestingly, Morgul, which obviously has the more, but it has this ghoul part as well, we find also in the longer term Minas Morgul, which in the Council of Elrond we're told means the Tower of Sorcery. So the word black is not used in the gloss for Minas Morgul, right? We're told it means the Tower of Sorcery. So what's going on here? It's pretty obvious, I think, if you just think of other Minuses, that the Minas means tower, but the Morgul must mean sorcery. So why would Morgul mean sorcery if it's got the more part in it? It's obviously this idea of sort of black magic. Exactly. That's, I think, a really good way of thinking about it. It's particularly drawing attention to the fact that this sorcery is a bad thing. Yeah, sorcery is black art. Exactly. So we can work out this sort of stuff just from considering the meaning of these words with the components. There are other examples where the ghoul is used. So Dol Guldur, for example, the tower that Sauron, well, the hill that Sauron returned to after the Second Age, and was, you know, where the necromancer was, as the necromancer he was during the Hobbit and so on. And also in Nazgul, although I'll point out Nazgul is actually a different language, but it still has that ghoul component. So there's somehow this notion of, and we're told, remember, the Nazgul means ring wraith as well. So it's interesting that here there's sort of this sense of a wraith in the ghoul, but it also has something to do with sorcery and so on. We might need a little bit more examples to tease out the nuance there. Dol Guldur, as well as the ghoul, has the Dua part, which is the Dua we find in Barad-dûr. And we're not told, I don't think we're told in Fellowship, but we're told later in Lord of the Rings that the Barad-dûr stands for the dark tower. So there's a sense in which Dua is it probably means dark. And so it's interesting that you've kind of got Morgul, black, a black ghoul, and Guldur, a dark ghoul. Two different ways of sort of conveying that idea of sorcery and black magic and so on. Okay, I won't say anything more about the Moor or the ghoul or the Dua part. Let's consider the door part. Some of you already mentioned in the chat, of course, that we get things like Gondor, and Eriador is another one. And of course, Eriador and Gondor are both regions, right? So it makes sense. We've already established that maybe the word door has something to do with land, an area of Middle Earth, and indeed we find it in things like Eriador and Gondor, and a bunch of others as well. But these are the obvious ones, particularly in Fellowship of the Ring, that we find out. So that raises the question. I won't touch on area, but the Gon part of Gondor. Yes, we do get it, for example, in Doriath, although I don't know that Doriath is not mentioned in Fellowship of the Ring, which is one of the reasons I didn't bring it up here. I don't even know if it's mentioned at all in Lord of the Rings. But yes, we find lots. When the Silmarillion came out, it was a wonderful validation of a lot of theories that people had about the languages, because the Silmarillion, not only in the main text of the Silmarillion, gives us a lot more examples of place names and people's names and so on, but it also has an appendix at the end that actually goes through and breaks down what a lot of these might mean. But for the purposes of this course, I want to pretend we don't know about that. Because I think it's more fun trying to work it out for ourselves without that information. And this is the situation, as I said, that readers in the second half of the 50s, all through the 60s, and the first 7 years of the 70s were confronted with, of not knowing anything that wasn't in Lord of the Rings. And I do, by the way, I'm going to mention this at the end, but I do have a follow-on course planned for after this one that where we will go into things like the Silmarillion and the history of Middle-earth and expand our knowledge of the languages from that. But we're going to focus just on Lord of the Rings here. Okay, so Gon. Where else do we get Gon? Okay, yes, he does mention. Thank you, Jenny. He does mention Doriath in the council, but not glossed. And there's we've got to be careful sometimes if it's not glossed. Exactly what's going on there. Here are a couple of words. There are undoubtedly others, but two immediate examples that come to mind where we get the Gon part of Gondor is Argonath and Gondolin. So Dor, at least in these examples, means land. So Mordor, black land. And we'll get to Gondor in a moment once we work out what the Gon might mean. So given this, so think about it. We've got Gondor, which is a place, Gondolin, which is a city, and we've got the Argonath. These all have the Gon element in them. Anyone have any idea? What do they have in, what does Gondor, Gondolin, and the Argonath have in common? Yes, it turns out to actually be stone. And Argonath is really the helpful thing here. I don't know that we would be able to work that out just from Gondor or even Gondolin. The fact that it's in Argonath really helps us because we're told Argonath means pillars of the kings. And so the R part, which we also find in Aragorn, has to do with being a noble, being a king. And so if Argonath has some element to it that means king and some part of it that means stone, what about the Arth part of it? And there's numerous examples of words ending in Arth, but I just want to give you an example of two. Osgiliath and Remirath. And helpfully these two are glossed for us. Osgiliath, we're told at the Council of Elrond, means the citadel of the stars. And we're told in chapter 3 of book 1 that Remirath means the netted stars. So what do the Argonath, the pillars of the kings, the citadel of the stars, and the netted stars have in common? And this is actually a little difficult because it's not immediately obvious what the pillars of the kings, the citadel of the stars, and the netted stars mean. But Krista's got it absolutely right. The thing that they have in common is that they're all plural. And it turns out that the Arth ending has to do with making things plural. But what we'll find is that it's a little bit more specific than that. It's actually what's referred to as a collective plural, and it's used whenever you're not just talking. We also find it in Perenniath, the halflings, but not in Fellowship of the Ring. We find it later in Lord of the Rings. It's used whenever there is a group of things that you want to refer to collectively. So it's not just any number of, it's not just hobbits in general or pillars in general or stars in general. It's a very specific group of pillars or hobbits or stars. That's what the Arth means. It's a collective plural. So it's a collection of things that are kind of treated as one group. And of course, then, if you look at something like Osgiliath, the tricky thing with Osgiliath and Remrirath is in their glosses, they both have the word stars, but we've run out of common elements. So the Arth is just the plural, the collective plural. So this suggests that maybe there are more than one word for star, or maybe one of them's using something metaphorically. We can't really tell just from this, but I will point out, we will get a little bit of information in a moment. I want to point out in Osgiliath, the Os part, well, actually, before I get to that, the Mir part in Remirath is also the Mir we get in Boromir and Faramir. I will cheat a little bit and tell you that it's actually the idea of a jewel. So Remirath being glossed as the netted stars is actually metaphorical. It's actually using jewel metaphorically for a star. The stars is not metaphorical, the stars is literal, but the underlying Elvish word has a metaphorical notion of jewel. And we'll see a bunch of other words that have mir in them with the jewel idea. But now, if you look at Osgiliath, right, the os part, which is actually ost in other contexts, we saw in Ungranost, and we also see in Fornost. So any suggestion as to what the ost part might mean? What does Ungranost, which remember is Isengard, Fornost, Osgiliath? Yeah, so it's fortress or citadel is the way it's glossed in Osgiliath. But yes, it's this idea of a sort of stronghold. It's a constructed building, castle. Yes, exactly. That idea that's shared between Isengard and Fornost and Osgiliath. And then Gil, we find in Gil-galad. And we're explicitly told that Gil-galad means starlight. So, given that Osgiliath means citadel of the stars and Gil-galad means starlight, what do you think Gil means? Star, exactly. Exactly. And then what might Galad mean? If Gil-galad means starlight, then Galad presumably means light. Exactly. And we find it in Galadriel, whose name we're told elsewhere has to do with radiance and so on. Okay. Yes, Jenny Gill stuff. New name for you, Jenny. Okay. I've got a lot more to get through and not much time, so I'm going to unfortunately rush through some of this, but I want to point out some other things. Orodruin, the Fire Mountain, Ered Nimrais, the White Mountains. The difference, these are both to do with mountains. One's singular and one's plural. And again, this comes back to that's the way that Sindarin words are made plural. Orod is the singular for mountain. Ered is the plural for mountains. And we see this as well with Ammon. You can guess what Ammon might mean because we're told Ammon Hen is the hill of sight, Ammon Hlau is the hill of hearing. But then we're told the bleak hills of the Emun Mul. So Ammon Hill, Emun Hills. And I apologize for rushing through this in the interest of time. I do want to get to some of the poetry. But hopefully you're getting this real sense of the puzzle solving that we can do by putting these examples side by side and seeing what's the same about the form, what's the same about the meaning, what can we extract about that and get us an idea about how the language is working. We already saw Minas Morgul, meaning the Tower of Sorcery, but in the Council of Elrond, we get all of these within 2 paragraphs of one another. Minas Ithil, Minas Anor, Minas Tirith, and we're told they're all towers of the rising moon, the setting sun, the guard. So not only do we work out that Minas means tower, but we get a word for moon and sun and guard, and as we already talked about, sorcery. Interestingly, that Minas also appears in Anuminas, although that's not glossed. But the Noom part of that we also find in Numenor. And then I'll just quickly mention, some of you may have noticed that there are an awful lot of rivers that have Duin in them. Anduin, Baranduin, Escalduin. They all have that Duin part. And surprise, surprise, it would, Duin seems to mean river. Although you do have rivers. We already saw the Methaethel does not have Duin in it. Confusingly, Bruinen almost looks like it does because it's got the UIN. But we're told Bruinen means loud water. And it turns out the way to split Bruinen is actually Brui and Nen. And that Nen part we also find in Nen Hithuel. And we can perhaps speculate about what those various components mean. But in the interest of time, I'll just continue through. I'm going to be what you doing, river stuff. That's well played. I want to briefly talk about this other example of parallel translation, although we'll go into it in a lot more detail in the main course. But we're actually told the 3 mountaintops. We've already talked about Moria being the black pit, and again, Moor and black appears there. But we also get Caradhras, the red horn, Celebdil, Silvertine, Funwithal, Cloudy Head. We won't worry too much about their Khuzdul meanings now, although we will talk about that in the main course. But this gives us a hint about a bunch of things. Karadras, Kelebdil, the Keleb in particular, we see a lot. And it pretty clearly refers to things that are silver. I want to point out, though, there's a couple of interesting things that that the Karadras in particular is interesting. Karadras, which means red horn, seems to have two components to it. One presumably means red and one presumably means horn. But I just want to point out the ras part, which I will tell you now seems associated with things with horn in the name, is also what we see in Nimrais. Remember, Ered Nimrais is the White Mountains. And so you may wonder, well, the Ered is the mountains, so Nimrais presumably means white, but we've got this word that seems to, it can't mean red, it means horn. Nimrais actually means white horns. Again, we're getting this Sindarin pluralization by making things more I-like, because it's white horns, not white horn. So technically, they're the White Horn Mountains, not just the White Mountains. And Nim, of course, means white. We see that Nimloth being a good example in Lord of the Rings. The Nimloth, of course, is the white tree. Although Loth doesn't mean tree, we can potentially work out what Loth might mean. But Nim we can work out means white. Okay, I do want to spend the last 10 minutes or so looking at some poems. And unfortunately, we'll spend an entire class going through these poems in the full class. But I just, again, want to give you a flavor for this. This is the first Elvish poem that we get in Lord of the Rings. We get it in chapter 1 of book 2. It's not translated. So this is fun because we're not actually told in Lord of the Rings what this means. But you may note, I want you to just look at this, and as I said, we're going to go through this very, very quickly. I want you to just consider some things you may have seen before, even in this class. Gil, Mir. We've got some things ending in Ath, Galav, Remen. So we get Palan, as in Palantir. We get these little components that give us a clue as to what this poem might be about. Fanwi, exactly, in Fanwilos, because we saw the word for cloudy head had Fanwi in it. I won't poll the audience for other things. In the main class, we can go through in detail about this. But a couple of things I want to point out. Remirath, we're told, are the netted stars. And so if Mir means jewel and Rath means the collective plural, that suggests that Rem has something to do with netting or a mesh or something like that. We're told that Galadrim means the tree people. And so Galav, this might have something to do with trees and meshing or netting or something like that. We're told that Menel Vargor means swordsman of the sky, and we get this Menel here, which might have something to do with the sky, perhaps. So we get these little pieces. It requires quite a bit of detective work to piece it together that we don't have time for now. Interestingly, a whole book earlier, in chapter 3 of book 1, we are told about another instance where the elves are chanting to Elbereth. Now, this is not a translation. This is a different poem. But there are certain elements in here that might help us to work out some of this poem. And I encourage you, we'll do this in the main class, but if you don't attend that class, I still encourage you to take a look at the poem, the Elvish poem on the left, and see how much you might be able to work out of what's going on. Okay, there's another big poem we get in Fellowship of the Ring that I've shown on the right. And the main thing I want you to initially observe is the differences between the two. Look at the poem on the left and look at the poem on the right. And consider this question. Are these the same language? If you just look at the letters that are used, the letter combinations that are used, the typical endings that you find, it becomes pretty clear that these are probably not the same language. And in fact, this is Sindarin on the left, Quenya on the right. Although, as I said, they're not called that in the books themselves. They're referred to, the one on the right is referred to as, the High Elven tongue. But it's a lot, yeah, it's almost more florally or something. There's definitely an aesthetic element to it as well, right? Ornate, yeah, that's a great word for it. You'll notice that we get these E's with the diaresis on them, the two dots. We'll actually see, if you count through them, many more of the words on the right-hand side end in vowels. There are certain combinations of letters that we find on the left that we don't find on the right. And so we get a sense that, just in terms of the sounds that are used, these languages are quite different. Although it turns out the languages are related to one another. And especially looking at Appendix E, we start to piece together what the relationship is between these two languages, which is fun. I want to point out some things. There's just a couple of things I want to point out here. I'll make it bigger so you can see. We get Vardo here and Varda here, which gives us a hint that maybe there's some sort of ending that you change depending on the context. This is Varda and this is Vardo. Why is it Vardo here and Varda here? We get things like Sindanorello, Sindar. What does that mean? We get more here. What might that mean? We get things like this Hiruvalye, but then down here it's Elye Hiruva. So it's the liet bit has been broken out into its own word here, and we just have the Hiruva. Right? We get all this kind of different things that give us hints as to what this might mean. Now, the great thing is we are actually told what this means. And we don't have time to get into this, but we are given a translation.
We still have 10 minutes, so hopefully.
Yeah. It's fine. I do want to make sure that we do have time to actually make some conclusions. But I want to point, we do have a good 4 minutes now to point out a few things. So, because we do get a translation of this. And this is actually something really interesting about the way Tolkien presents his invented languages in Lord of the Rings. He almost never translates Sindarin, but he almost always translates Quenya. And again, this comes back to this idea of trying to give us a more in-world perspective of the commonality of the language. Sindarin was widely spoken. It was spoken by not just elves, but by Gondorians as well. And so if you're a Gondorian, there's no need to translate Sindarin. You all know Sindarin already. If you have a bit of Quenya, then it's helpful for the Gondorians if you translate it. And so I think Tolkien was doing a lot of that kind of stuff in Lord of the Rings as well. Not bothering to translate Sindarin for us, but translating Quenya for us, which I think is really interesting. So we do have an exact translation of this. And I'll just point out a few things just in the few minutes that we have. So, Laurier, gold. You can probably think of some words that have laur in them that refer to gold, like the name of the golden of the two trees. Leaves, we get lassi here. Think of a certain member of the fellowship whose name has Lass in it, right? Legolas, Greenleaf. Greenleaf is not his Greenleaf is not his surname. Greenleaf is a translation of Legolas, and the last bit meaning leaf. And we see lassi, leaves. Interestingly, just a side note, I said that the way that you make plurals in Sindarin is to make the vowels more I-like. Well, one of the ways you make plurals in Quenya is you just put an I at the end. Istari, Palantiri, lassi, and they're related. The fact that you make vowels more I-like in Sindarin, but you actually just put an I at the end in Quenya is related. And we'll talk about that in the main course. We get Mirovoreva with a mir bit, but this is actually, you might think of Mirovor. And we get here talk about sweet draughts of the sweet mead. I mentioned before about we get Vardo and Varda. Well, if you look at where Varda is, this is here, now the Kindler Varda, the Queen of Stars. But up here, we get the blue vaults of Varda. suggesting that maybe this is how the possessive is done in Quenya. This is Vada, this is of Vada. And obviously we'd probably want to see more evidence of this, more examples of this, but it's a tantalizing hint as to some of the grammar of the language, just comparing how these words change form depending on their context. What about this Sindarin? Out of a grey country. Sindar is another way of saying grey. The grey elves are the Sindar. And the Sindanoriello, notice this ello ending. We also get down here Romello. And Romello corresponds to from the east. So notice the ello seems to have something to do with coming out of, coming from. And so you can start to piece together all these little pieces. Let me see if there's any more that we can point out. You could probably guess. Look at all the places where si is used. So si is used here, here, and here. Let's look at these lines in the English translation. This line is, who now shall refill the cup for me? This line is, for now the Kinlavada, the Queen of Stars. This line is, now lost to those from the east is Valimar. So any guess as to what seat might mean? What do those English lines that I just read have in common? Now, exactly. Who now? For now, exactly. So you can see we can actually work out quite a bit of how the language works. Now, to answer Annie's question about an etymology book, there are a handful of glosses that Tolkien gives in Appendix E. And of course, the whole point of this course is to work it out for ourselves. The appendix in the Silmarillion has a lot. But yes, the work of the Elvish linguistic... Tolkien himself had lists of etymologies that are published in the History of Middle-earth. There's literally a text called the Etymologies. So the History of Middle-earth has a bunch. And then everything else has sort of been compiled together by the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship and published in books like Palma Eldalamberon and Vinya Tengwa. So there's tremendous resources out there for these lists. There's also Eldamo, a website that captures all this data. But for the purposes of this course, I'm trying to ignore that because I really want us to place ourselves in the position of people. Well, the people actually making those resources, for example. Like, what's it like for the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship trying to work that out, rather than just being given the etymologies on a platter, so to speak. Okay. Let me wrap up in the final few minutes. So just to conclude, I want to conclude and then say a little bit more about some other courses that I'm running or planning on running. So there's a few things I hope that people have gotten out of this, as well as just sort of an overall appreciation for what Tolkien did and how he used his invented languages in Lord of the Rings. I talked a couple of times about this being a linguistic perspective of hobbits, and Tolkien really trying to play on that idea of familiarity. The fact that Tolkien had realistic place names made up of these recurring components that we can actually work out a lot from. That he made frequent use of parallel translation, revealing the meaning in world. So actually having characters tell us what things mean in not a forced way. We also saw the different, what's referred to as phonoaesthetics of different languages, right? The difference in what the sounds of Quenya and Sindarin, and we will talk a lot more about that in the main course. But also a little bit about the historical relationship between the languages. And we will talk about all of these in the full course. But let me just finish up by saying, so of course there is a full course that this has just been a taster of. It's one of 4 language-related courses that I'm running. I also run one on Tolkien's writing systems that focuses purely on the Kiev and the Tengwa, a little bit of the Hobbit runes and even the Goblin alphabet in the Father Christmas letters. But that's a writing system focused one, and that's actually a great follow-on. I've not yet run this, but hoping to at some point. So, this course is focused entirely on Lord of the Rings. But there is a course I'm planning called Tolkien's Invented Languages, Next Steps Beyond the Lord of the Rings. And that's a course where I want to bring in the Silmarillion, History of Middle-earth, and things like the Lost Road, where we get the etymologies and stuff like that, and the work of the Vineyard Tengwar and stuff. So if you're really interested in getting into that material beyond Lord of the Rings, please vote for that course so it runs. And then there's also Loudon's report on the Adonaic language. So there's only one language that Tolkien did only a single version on. I will talk a little bit about Khuzdul, even in the invented languages in Lord of the Rings. We don't, unfortunately, have a ton of information about Khuzdul. But I will cover a little bit of Khuzdul in Tolkien's invented languages in the Lord of the Rings. But there's only one language that Tolkien ever wrote a decent grammatical description of and didn't change his mind, never went back to. We have one pristine version of, and that's the Adonaic language, conveyed in the Notion Club papers in volume 9 of History of Middle-earth. So at some point, if there's enough interest, I would love to do an entire course just going through Loudon's report on the Adonaic language. It's fun just because we're not dealing with Tolkien changing his mind. We get this pristine language description, not complete, but at least unchanging. So please do vote if you want these to run. And dead on 11 o'clock,
Great.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope this was fun. Even if you're not doing the main course, I hope you learnt stuff. But I hope to see many of you in the main course in June.